An enormous concrete wall already towers above the Sacramento River in Northern California, holding back the largest reservoir in the state and serving as one of the most important pieces of water infrastructure in the American West. Yet after decades of debate, legal disputes, environmental reviews, political battles, and shifting federal priorities, a proposal that many believed had faded away is once again moving forward. Federal officials have now committed tens of millions of dollars toward preparations for raising Shasta Dam. The proposed increase sounds modest at first glance. 18.5 feet, or approximately 5.6 meters, added to a structure that already stands more than 600 feet high. But beneath that seemingly simple number lies a much larger question. Why has a project debated for more than a decade returned to the national spotlight? And why does a relatively small increase in height continue to generate such intense controversy? The discussion is often framed around water storage. Supporters point to the promise of more water during drought years and greater flexibility for California's vast agricultural economy. Critics argue that the benefits are smaller than advertised and come with substantial costs that extend far beyond construction expenses. Between those positions lies a complicated reality involving federal funding, state law, reservoir operations, property impacts, tribal lands, recreation areas, and the future management of California's increasingly stressed water system. The latest development arrived when the federal government announced $40 million in funding for planning and pre-construction activities connected to a potential raise of Shasta Dam. The money is only a fraction of what would ultimately be required, but it signals renewed momentum for a project that has remained dormant for years. Federal officials say the funding will help advance planning efforts intended to increase storage capacity at California's largest reservoir. Estimates indicate that the proposed enlargement would create approximately 634,000 acre-feet of additional storage capacity. That amount is often described as enough water to supply millions of people for a year, depending on assumptions regarding consumption rates. To understand why the proposal remains controversial, it is necessary to understand what Shasta Dam already represents. Completed during the 1940s as a cornerstone of the federal Central Valley Project, Shasta Dam transformed California's water landscape. Located north of Redding, the structure impounds Shasta Lake, a reservoir that can currently store roughly 4.5 million acre-feet of water. The reservoir serves multiple functions. It provides water supplies for agricultural districts, supports municipal users, contributes to flood management, generates hydroelectric power, and helps maintain river conditions downstream. The dam became one of the most important water storage facilities in the western United States and remains central to California's complex water delivery network. The proposal now under consideration would raise the crest of the dam by 18.5 feet, approximately 5.6 meters. Although that increase may appear relatively small compared with the overall height of the structure, the resulting effect on reservoir storage would be significant. Federal studies estimate an increase in storage capacity of roughly 13 to 14%. Total reservoir capacity would rise by approximately 634,000 acre-feet. At full pool, water levels would extend farther into tributary arms and adjacent shoreline areas surrounding Shasta Lake. For many observers, that storage gain forms the heart of the argument in favor of the project. California's water system has faced repeated stress from droughts, population growth, agricultural demand, and changing precipitation patterns. Reservoir operators constantly balance competing priorities. During wet years, they must maintain space for flood protection. During dry years, they must stretch available supplies across cities, farms, industries, and ecosystems. Additional storage capacity can appear attractive because it potentially allows more water to be captured during high flow periods and retained for future use. Federal officials have repeatedly described the proposed raise as a way to strengthen water reliability and improve long-term storage flexibility. Recent funding announcements emphasize broader goals of enhancing water security, supporting communities dependent on reliable supplies, and improving the resilience of Western water infrastructure. Yet the project's opponents argue that the headline storage number does not tell the entire story. One of the most frequently cited figures in the debate involves the distinction between storage capacity and actual water yield. Increasing reservoir size does not automatically mean that equivalent amounts of new water become available every year. Water availability depends on hydrology, precipitation patterns, operational requirements, environmental regulations, and downstream obligations. Documents frequently referenced by opponents note that while storage capacity could increase by 634,000 acre-feet, estimated average additional annual water deliveries are substantially lower. Critics contend that the gap between the large storage figure and the smaller expected average yield is rarely highlighted in public discussions. They argue that the project's practical benefits may appear less dramatic when evaluated against California's overall annual water use. Another factor drawing attention is cost. When federal studies examined the proposal years ago, construction estimates approached $1.4 billion in then-current dollars. Since that time, inflation, labor costs, material expenses, and broader construction trends have altered the financial landscape. Recent discussions frequently place potential costs closer to $2 billion, while some estimates cited by opponents suggest totals could climb even higher depending on final design requirements and market conditions. The newly announced $40 million therefore represents only an early investment relative to the scale of the overall undertaking. The money is intended for planning and pre-construction work rather than actual construction. Federal officials acknowledge that substantially greater funding would be necessary before any physical raising of the dam could occur. Questions surrounding who ultimately pays for the project have become increasingly important. Historically, large federal water storage projects often involved cost-sharing arrangements with non-federal partners. Over time, disagreements emerged regarding who would contribute funding and how benefits would be distributed. Previous efforts to secure substantial outside financial participation encountered obstacles, contributing to delays and uncertainty regarding the project's future. Recent changes in federal funding rules have intensified debate because critics argue that taxpayers may shoulder a larger portion of future costs than originally envisioned. Financial considerations, however, represent only part of the controversy. The proposed enlargement would alter shorelines around portions of Shasta Lake. Studies and planning documents have identified numerous areas potentially affected by higher water levels. Recreational facilities, roads, bridges, campgrounds, marinas, and private properties could require relocation, modification, acquisition, or other adjustments if reservoir levels are expanded to match the enlarged storage capacity. Maps produced during project evaluations illustrate how higher water elevations would extend farther into existing shoreline zones. Among the most frequently discussed impacts are those affecting communities near the reservoir. Planning analyses have identified private parcels located within areas potentially influenced by the expanded reservoir footprint. The prospect of land acquisition has fueled concern among residents who have followed the project through multiple planning cycles spanning many years. Recreation presents another major issue. Shasta Lake serves as a significant destination for boating, fishing, camping, and other outdoor activities. Reservoir recreation supports local businesses and attracts visitors from across California and beyond. Project documents acknowledge that higher reservoir levels could affect existing recreational infrastructure. Some facilities would require relocation or redesign, while others could face more substantial changes depending on final project implementation. Opponents frequently point to these impacts when arguing that the benefits of the project must be weighed against losses affecting public access and recreation-based economic activity. The legal landscape may be even more complex than the engineering challenges. For years, one of the central obstacles confronting the proposal has involved California's Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. Critics argue that expanding Shasta Reservoir would conflict with protections associated with portions of the McCloud River system. The issue has generated extensive legal debate and remains unresolved despite repeated efforts to advance the project. Several public officials and organizations continue to maintain that existing state law presents a significant barrier to implementation. Federal environmental reviews have also played a major role in shaping the project's history. The Bureau of Reclamation spent years studying the proposal through feasibility analyses and environmental impact statements. Despite identifying a preferred enlargement alternative, the agency's final feasibility process ultimately stopped short of recommending immediate construction because several major issues remained unresolved. Funding questions, legal uncertainties, environmental concerns, and procedural considerations all contributed to the project's prolonged status. No final construction decision emerged from those earlier evaluations. The return of federal funding has therefore revived a debate many believed was effectively stalled. Another aspect receiving renewed attention involves tribal lands and cultural resources. When Shasta Dam was originally constructed during the 20th century, large areas of land were inundated by the creation of Shasta Lake. For the Winnemem-Wintu people, those changes carried profound consequences because ancestral lands, villages, and cultural sites disappeared beneath reservoir waters. The proposed raise has generated continued opposition from tribal representatives who argue that additional cultural and historical areas would be affected if water levels rise further. Federal documents and public discussions surrounding the project have repeatedly acknowledged concerns regarding impacts on tribal resources. The issue extends beyond questions of archaeology or historical preservation. It touches on broader debates regarding land stewardship, cultural continuity, and the legacy of major infrastructure projects constructed during an earlier era when consultation requirements differed significantly from contemporary standards. Meanwhile, environmental concerns remain central to the discussion. One argument supporting the enlargement is that greater storage capacity could help managers maintain colder water releases downstream during critical periods. Cold water is especially important for fish species that depend on specific temperature conditions. Reservoir operations at Shasta already play a crucial role in regulating temperatures within portions of the Sacramento River system. However, environmental reviews have also identified potential adverse impacts associated with expanded reservoir levels. Discussions frequently focus on habitat changes, fisheries considerations, and broader ecosystem effects. Critics argue that the anticipated ecological benefits may not fully offset environmental disruptions associated with the project. Supporters counter that additional operational flexibility could improve management options during drought periods. The resulting debate illustrates the challenge of balancing water supply objectives with environmental stewardship in a heavily managed river system. Political dynamics have further complicated the issue. The proposal has survived changes in presidential administrations, congressional leadership, state governments, and federal agencies. Different administrations have viewed water storage expansion through different policy lenses. Some emphasize infrastructure development and increased storage capacity. Others prioritize environmental protection, legal compliance, and alternative approaches to water management. As a result, the project has repeatedly advanced, stalled, reappeared, and stalled again. The latest allocation of federal funds represents another chapter in that long cycle. Whether it ultimately leads to construction remains uncertain, but it clearly demonstrates that the idea remains very much alive within federal water policy discussions. An important reality often overlooked in public conversations is that raising a dam involves far more than adding concrete to the top of an existing structure. Engineering modifications would extend well beyond the visible crest. Reservoir operations, shoreline infrastructure, transportation connections, utility systems, environmental mitigation measures, and property adjustments all require extensive planning. Every additional foot of water elevation can affect large areas around a reservoir's perimeter, particularly in tributary valleys where rising water extends considerable distances upstream. That reality helps explain why a project involving an 18.5-foot increase has generated planning efforts spanning decades and projected costs reaching into the billions of dollars. The broader context is California's ongoing struggle to adapt its water infrastructure to modern challenges. Many of the state's major reservoirs were designed and built during the 20th century under hydrologic assumptions that are increasingly being reevaluated. Population growth, Changing precipitation patterns, prolonged drought cycles, ecosystem pressures, and competing demands have placed extraordinary strain on systems originally designed for a different era. Supporters of expanding Shasta Dam view additional storage as a logical response to those pressures. They argue that California should maximize the usefulness of existing infrastructure rather than rely solely on new facilities. Opponents argue that storage expansion alone cannot solve underlying water management challenges. They contend that conservation, groundwater management, water recycling, infrastructure modernization, and alternative storage strategies may offer more efficient approaches in the long term. These competing visions help explain why the debate remains so persistent. The $40 million federal allocation does not authorize construction, nor does it resolve the project's legal, environmental, financial, or political challenges. It does, however, move planning efforts forward and signals that federal officials remain interested in pursuing the possibility of a larger Shasta Dam. Another issue receiving increasing attention involves the relationship between surface water storage and groundwater depletion. Across large portions of California, decades of groundwater pumping have lowered water tables, contributed to land subsidence, and altered local hydrologic conditions. Supporters of additional reservoir storage frequently argue that capturing more surface water during wet years can reduce pressure on groundwater basins during drought periods. The logic is straightforward. If more water is available in reservoirs, fewer users may need to rely on underground reserves when dry conditions return. Yet the effectiveness of that strategy depends heavily on how the stored water is ultimately distributed and used. Additional storage alone does not guarantee changes in groundwater extraction patterns. Water management policies, delivery infrastructure, agricultural demand, and local groundwater regulations all influence whether increased reservoir capacity translates into measurable reductions in groundwater pumping. This distinction is often overshadowed by the larger discussion about storage volumes and reservoir elevations. The timing of the renewed federal funding is also notable because it arrives during a period of heightened national attention on water infrastructure resilience. Across the western United States, reservoirs have experienced dramatic fluctuations in water levels over the past decade. Some facilities have reached historically low levels during prolonged droughts, while intense atmospheric river events have demonstrated the challenges of capturing large volumes of runoff during exceptionally wet periods. Water managers increasingly face the difficult task of preparing for both extremes. Under those conditions, proponents view larger reservoirs as a form of insurance. Additional storage capacity can provide a larger operational buffer when unusually wet years occur. Instead of releasing water to maintain flood control space, managers may have greater flexibility to retain some of that water for future use. Whether the projected benefits justify the financial and environmental costs remains at the center of the ongoing debate, but the argument reflects broader concerns about managing increasingly variable water supplies. Another aspect that receives less public attention involves hydroelectric generation. Shasta Dam is not solely a water storage facility. It is also a major source of renewable electricity. Reservoir elevations influence the hydraulic head available for power generation, and operational decisions often involve balancing water supply objectives with energy production needs. While water storage remains the primary focus of discussions regarding the dam raise, changes in reservoir operations could also affect hydroelectric performance under certain conditions. The project additionally raises questions about the lifespan of major infrastructure. Shasta Dam has been operating for more than 8 decades. Throughout its history, engineers have conducted maintenance, upgrades, and safety evaluations to ensure continued performance. Raising the dam would represent one of the most significant modifications ever undertaken at the facility. Such a project would require careful integration with existing structures, spillway systems, operational equipment, and reservoir management procedures developed over generations. For nearby communities, uncertainty remains one of the most significant challenges. The project has been discussed for so many years that residents have experienced multiple cycles of planning, environmental review, funding proposals, legal challenges, and political announcements. Some property owners have spent years wondering whether future reservoir expansion might affect land use decisions, investments, recreation access, or property values. The latest funding announcement has once again revived those questions. The debate also highlights a broader reality about large infrastructure projects in the 21st century. Modern proposals must navigate layers of environmental review, legal compliance, cultural resource protection, public participation requirements, engineering analysis, and financial scrutiny that often extend over decades. Projects once conceived as straightforward construction efforts now involve complex evaluations of ecological, social, cultural, and economic consequences. Shasta Dam exemplifies that evolution. As planning advances, federal agencies will continue examining technical requirements, environmental considerations, and operational implications associated with the proposed raise. Additional studies, permitting processes, consultations, and funding decisions are likely to shape the project's future trajectory. Even with federal support, substantial hurdles remain before any construction activity could begin. For now, the most important detail may not be the 18.5 feet of additional height itself. The more significant reality is that the proposal has returned to active consideration after years of uncertainty. The $40 million recently allocated does not build the dam higher, but it keeps the concept moving forward. It ensures that planning continues, environmental and engineering work proceeds, and discussions about California's future water storage capacity remain firmly on the agenda. That is the part often lost in simplified descriptions of the project. The story is not merely about adding 18.5 feet, or approximately 5.6 meters, to an existing structure. It is about determining how California intends to balance water reliability, environmental stewardship, fiscal responsibility, cultural preservation, and infrastructure modernization in the decades ahead. The debate surrounding Shasta Dam has endured because it sits at the intersection of all those competing priorities, and the latest federal funding ensures that the questions surrounding its future are far from settled.